This morning I'd invite you to take your Bibles and turn to the book of 2 Corinthians, and we'll be looking at chapter number 12. 2 Corinthians chapter number 12. I'd like to begin by reading the first 10 verses of this chapter. This chapter contains some pretty interesting information and a wonderful promise from God. The Bible says in verse number 1, "It is not expedient for me, doubtless to glory. I will come to visions and revelations of the Lord. I knew a man in Christ above 14 years ago. Whether in the body I cannot tell, or whether out of the body I cannot tell, God knoweth. Such an one caught up to the third heaven. And I knew such a man, whether in the body or out of the body I cannot tell, God knoweth, how that he was caught up into paradise, and heard unspeakable words, which it is not lawful for a man to utter. Of such an one will I glory, yet of myself I will not glory, but in mine infirmities. For though I would desire to glory, I shall not be a fool, for I will say the truth. But now I forbear, lest any man should think of me above that which he seeth me to be, or that he heareth of me, and lest I should be exalted above measure through the abundance of the revelations. There was given to me a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I should be exalted above measure. For this thing I besought the Lord thrice, that it might depart from me. And he said unto me, My grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore, I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in necessities, in persecutions, in distresses for Christ's sake, for when I am weak, then am I strong." Our theme for the year is Let Us Have Grace. And each month we've been looking at a different aspect of the grace of God, that it works in our life and is available to us. And here in the month of June, our emphasis is upon God's all-sufficient grace, particularly during times of suffering. You'll notice in verse number 9, this wonderful verse of Scripture, really a promise that God gives to us. Jesus said unto Paul, My grace is sufficient for thee, my strength is made perfect in weakness. Now this chapter here is part of the final section of the book of 2 Corinthians. It goes from chapter 10 through to chapter 13. And if we were to summarize this section in the book, we would say it is where Paul is defending his apostolic authority. Both of the epistles that he wrote to the Corinthian church, and there may have been a third non-canonical epistle, contain many rebukes and warnings to that church. It was a church that had many problems, and so a lot of the writings of Paul addressed particularly to that church dealt with the problems there. And sometimes he had to be very hard on them. Well, what happens when you hear hard preaching? When you hear preaching or teaching that is not setting well with the way you want it to be or the way you think it to be, well, a lot of times in the flesh, people will attack the messenger rather than answer the message. And that's exactly what happened in many cases with Paul. There were those in the church who attacked him, as if by putting him down, that would water down or negate the message that he was giving to them. For example, in chapter 10 and verse number 10, Paul realized what was going on. He said, "For his letters, say they, are weighty and powerful, but his bodily presence is weak and his speech contemptible." In other words, instead of dealing with the message from God that came through Paul, they picked on Paul's appearance and the weakness that he had in his body. But it's interesting, as Paul is defending his apostleship, that he is using as his main defense his sufferings for the cause of Christ. In verse number 11 here in chapter 12, he says, I am become a fool in glorying, ye have compelled me. For I ought to have been commended of you, for in nothing I am behind the very chiefest apostles, though I be nothing. Truly the signs of an apostle were wrought among you in all patience, in signs and wonders and mighty deeds. For what is it wherein ye were inferior to other churches, except it be that I myself was not burdensome to you? Forgive me this wrong. But what he was saying here is, that his sufferings were really his love for the church. That's what he was saying. This is my proof. It's not what I've said to you, but it's my love for you. And of course, there were false teachers that were there also vying for the minds and hearts of God's people, and Paul used his sufferings against them. And if you look back in chapter 11, he said in verse number 23, are they, speaking of these false teachers, are they ministers of Christ? I speak as a fool, I am more, in labours more abundant, in stripes above measure, in prisons more frequent, in deaths oft. And he went on to talk about how he had suffered. What are these false teachers doing? They just come in and nothing is really bothering them, but they're spreading their false doctrines and their lies. The Apostle Paul really had a lot that he could boast about when it came to his ministry. Here in chapter 12, he could boast about this out-of-body experience that he speaks of in the first 4 verses. I do believe that he's talking about himself. He says, I know a man, whether he was in the body or out of the body, I cannot tell. God knoweth. But I think that harkens back chronologically 14 years before, when Paul was stoned and dragged out of the city of Lystra as a dead man. Now, God revived him, but it seems that in that period of time that he was transported, at least in revelation, from God to the very presence of God in heaven. And what he saw in heaven, he said it was unlawful for me to write about. And we know that heaven is a place that, as the Bible says, eye hath not seen, nor ear heard, neither have it entered into the heart of man, the things that God hath prepared for them that love him. Heaven is that great. Heaven is that wonderful. And Paul, like the Apostle John, was given a glimpse of the glory that will follow this life. And he said, I could boast about those things. What other men have had such a vision from God? And he could have gloried in that. He said, I could glory in the revelations that were given to me, as Paul was responsible of receiving revelation from God and supernaturally recording that by the process of inspiration to give us much of the New Testament. As a man, he could boast and he could proclaim how God had used him in that way. But instead, he said in verse 5 of chapter 12, of such an one will I glory, yet of myself I will not glory, but in mine infirmities. Now, as we look at this passage, there are a number of words used to describe Paul's sufferings. Look at verse number 10, if you would, and we'll just list them here and explain these words. In verse number 10 of chapter 12, therefore I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in necessities, in persecutions, in distresses for Christ's sake. So there's a number of words, and you'll find these used throughout the epistle and in other places where Paul spoke about the sufferings that he endured for the cause of Christ. He uses the word infirmities. Well, the word infirmity means a sickness. He uses the word reproaches. That refers to the insults that were hurled at him and the disparaging of his message. He spoke of necessities, which would refer to deprivations. In chapter 11, verse 27, he spoke of those. He said, in weariness and painfulness, in watchings often, in hunger and thirst, in fastings often, in cold and nakedness. There were times when he was without the basic necessities of life, food, clothing, and shelter. And he suffered those things, and he refers to them there as necessities. Then he uses the word persecutions, which would refer to physical attacks against him. Again, in chapter 11, in verse 24 and 25, he says, "Of the Jews, 5 times received I 40 stripes, save one. Thrice was I beaten with rods. Once I was stoned." And these were the persecutions that he had endured up until this time in his ministry. And then he uses the word distresses there in verse number 10, and distresses means the difficult situations in which he found himself. He says in 2 Corinthians 11, verse 25 and 26, "Thrice I suffered shipwreck." Well, that's a distress. "And night and a day have I been in the deep, in journeyings often, in perils of waters, in perils of robbers." And all of these words really are used to describe different aspects of how he suffered for the cause of Christ. There's one other word, it's not in verse number 10, but it's used elsewhere, and that is the word affliction. And affliction refers to a physical hurt that has been caused by others or from an external source. Now, what I want you to know is that in all of these things that Paul endured and experienced, the grace of God is sufficient. My grace is sufficient. God said that to Paul. And we need to understand that whatever circumstances of life we may be going through that are hard times, whatever it is, the grace of God is sufficient. My grace is sufficient for thee. So this morning in this message, I want to be very narrow, and I want to hone in on just one of these words, and that is the word infirmity. We see it mentioned here in verse 10 as we saw, "Therefore I take pleasure in infirmities." But up in verse number 9 he says, "Most gladly therefore will I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me." And so this morning, if you can bear with me, we're going to talk about this idea of infirmity. And as I mentioned before, the word infirmity simply means a sickness. A sickness. In fact, it's the same Greek word, athenia, which is elsewhere translated as sick. And so we understand that word pretty well. It seems like every week we go through, there is somebody, one of the brethren or several of the brethren, who come down sick and are unable to be present with us. But this idea of sickness means a physical ailment or a weakness that is due to human frailty. All right, that's what it really is looking about. Now, in Paul's case, this affliction or this infirmity was something that God had allowed to come in his life. It seems like, as he speaks about a messenger of Satan there in verse number 7, that Satan had something to do with it. And that would remind us of what took place in the life of Job, where the devil said, "Let me touch his body," and God allowed that. Now, I'm glad that God allows, he gives permission to the devil, but the devil doesn't have free rein in our life. And so, for some reason, God allowed Satan to bring this infirmity into the life of Paul. And it is referred to as a thorn in the flesh. Well, you can imagine if you have a thorn, whether it's from a rose bush or some prickle that gets inside your flesh, a splinter for that matter, that it becomes very painful and very aggravating. Well, this thorn in the flesh, there's a lot of speculation as to what it was in the life of Paul. I happen to believe that it had something to do with his eyesight. The reason I would say that is because he mentions in the book of Galatians chapter 6, verse number 11, that he had written part of that. He signed off on that epistle himself, and he says, "You see how large a letter I have written with mine own hand." He would have been someone that we would say today he had Coke bottom glasses, and if he had to wear spectacles, they would have been highly magnifying. But he had a problem with his eyes, and you can imagine that as a preacher of the gospel, as a man who traveled and who was winning souls to Christ, that thorn in the flesh would have been really a problem for him. It would have hindered his ministry. It was a thorn in that it was a constant reminder to him. We would say it was a chronic condition. You might remember in the Old Testament when the Lord wrestled with Jacob as he was returning from Paddan Aram back to the land of Canaan, and the Lord wrestled with him through the night. And Jacob said to the Lord, "I will not let you go except you bless me." And the Lord reached out and touched the hollow of his thigh and shrunk his hamstring, so for the rest of his days, Jacob hobbled around with a limp. And that was a reminder to him of God and God's presence and God's working in his life. Well, now Paul is suffering this ailment, this affliction, he calls it an infirmity. So it was some kind of bodily illness that he was dealing with. Well, we understand sickness. Sickness really, when you get down to it, is nothing but the death principle at work. Going back to the Garden of Eden, when God said to Adam, "The day that you eat thereof, you shall surely die," that death was not just a spiritual death of separating man from God, but it ultimately resulted in a physical separation of the soul and the spirit from the body. We would know it as physical death. And it's working in all of us, beloved. We need to understand that. The Bible says, "As for man, his days are as grass, as a flower of the field, so he flourisheth. For the wind passeth over it, and it is gone, and the place thereof shall know of it no more." That's in Psalm 103. That's a pretty concerning description of human life. We're just like the grass, you know. Right now the grass is growing. Right now the grass is thriving. It's in its prime. And the weeds are coming up. And they're flowering in the fields. And we look at them and say, "Wow, look at that field that's full of yellow daisies. Come back in a week's time, it's nothing." And the Bible says that our life, really, when measured against the vastness of eternity, is just like that. The fact is, beloved, that all of us are going to die at some point unless the Lord returns and snatches us up into the clouds to be with him. And in that dying process, infirmities are going to come. Now, for some, it'll be a terminal illness, perhaps, with a rapid decline. I think most of us would say, well, if I have to die, that's how I'd like to go. I don't want to have something that lingers. I want something that will take me very quickly, and I can be with the Lord without a lot of suffering. That's a natural thought. When some will pass away in that manner, they may have a cancer. They may have a heart attack or something and die even unexpectedly. But for others, there might be a lingering infirmity that they must endure for years. And that takes a measure of God's grace, I'll tell you that. To go through that, to say, well, I've got this issue and it's something that's going to be with me until I close my eyes in death. You know, there are some infirmities that are brought on or hastened by our own behavior. I mean, let's face it, if you're going to smoke cigarettes, don't be surprised if you come down with lung disease, cancer or emphysema. If you are drinking alcohol, then don't be surprised if one day you are struck with liver disease. If you are not very hygienic in your daily practice, don't be surprised if you contract hepatitis. If you are an angry person, you'll likely to have high blood pressure or heart disease. You know, that's why the Bible tells us as Christians in 1 Corinthians chapter 6 that we need to keep our temple, the temple of our body, undefiled. We need to live a clean life because God wants to use us in his service. If you're going to do things that are going to damage your body and shorten your life, that's not a good thing. And we know that some infirmities that people suffer really have been brought on by their own sinful behavior. If you are a worrier, don't be surprised if you have stomach problems. The Bible says that envy is as rottenness to the bones. And in some cases, God will even bring chastisement, not in every case of sickness, but sometimes. We know that those who came to the Lord's table in the church at Corinth were treating it in a way that it wasn't meant to be, and the Bible says, many are weak and sickly among you. There's all kinds of reasons why we get infirmities, but the infirmities are a fact of life. They come without reason or human cause sometimes. You may escape a death that's brought on by a degenerative disease, but we're all going to experience the feebleness of increasing old age. And that's when we look to our genetic family and say, how long do I have? Well, sickness is a fact of life. If you think about it, most of the prayer requests that are brought up on our prayer times from the membership of our church and even from the letters that we receive from evangelists, it seems to me that the majority of the prayer requests are concerning sickness. Pray for so-and-so who's sick, and pray for this person who is sick. Many here have, and many are suffering from some infirmity. But infirmity has to do with the frailty of our flesh, that as we age, we're going to deteriorate, and it's going to result in one day we're going to die. Now, I'm not talking about coughs and colds, by the way. We all get those. And think about it this way. When Paul spoke about this infirmity that he had, and maybe not at this point in time, but for a lot of his ministry, he had one of the best doctors traveling with him all the way, Dr. Luke. And I'm sure when Paul had a sniffle, Dr. Luke had something for that. We're not talking about those kind of illnesses that come and go, are just part of everyday life, but we're talking about that frailty that is bringing us down in our life. And I think you can think in your life, and I'm not going to bring out things that I know, but I know that there are many here who would say, yes, I can see that in my life. But here's the thing. God gives us a great promise, doesn't he? In verse number 9, he said, Jesus said unto me, my grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. And so what I want to speak on is not just on infirmities, but how do you experience the grace of God when you are sick? When you are laid up, when you really see that your life is no longer going to be what it once was because of a frailty or because of a infirmity in your life. You know, sometimes, let's be honest, 2 Corinthians 12:9 can be an empty platitude. Well, brother, sorry to hear that you're sick. God's grace is sufficient. In fact, I think sometimes the most unhelpful kind of counseling is just to throw a Bible verse at someone. Here's a Bible verse for you. Now, that's not to say that the Word of God doesn't bring comfort. We read a psalm earlier, a psalm of great comfort. But you know, people don't just need a Bible verse, they need help. They need some understanding. They need something more than just words and platitudes. It reminds me of the situation with Job. If you're familiar with that, Job was afflicted. He had an infirmity that brought him down. And he had some friends who came by, and they threw words at him. In the 16th chapter of Job, listen to this. In verse 1, then Job answered these friends of his, and he said, I have heard many such things. Miserable comforters are ye. Are ye all? He said, shall vain words have an end? When are you going to stop with just telling me, keep your chin up, and all of these platitudes? He said, what emboldeneth thee that thou answerest? I could also speak as ye do. If your soul were in my soul's stead, I could heap up words against you and shake my head at you. But I would strengthen you with my mouth, and the moving of my lips should assuage your grief. Though I speak, my grief is not assuaged. And though I forbear, what am I eased? You know, we have to be careful when we're helping or trying to encourage those who are down sick. They're not looking for just reasons. Well, brother, what have you done to make you sick? God must be chastising you, and we have all these opinions. But what we need is words that will comfort, words that will bring comfort, and instead of being a physician of no value. So how do you comfort the infirm? What do you say when someone is down sick? Well, you know, the fact is often you say nothing. You just be there for them. You weep with them when they are in pain. You comfort them just by your presence. And that's difficult for a lot of us, especially when you have not experienced what they're experiencing. A lot of you young, healthy people, you look at those that get sick and you wonder, what's wrong with them? Because I'm healthy. Well, you know, the experience of pain is certainly something that will change your view, and I'm not wishing that on anyone. But it is difficult to comfort those that we don't really have a personal experience of the comfort of God. But he says, my grace is sufficient for thee. So how is that to be? I've been thinking about this for quite some time. How is the grace of God sufficient? Is it just giving a Bible verse, or is it something that God does in our life? How can I be strong for the Lord when I'm physically weak and infirmed? What does this verse mean? Does it mean that the grace of God will take away my sickness? I don't think so, not normally. In verse number 8, Paul prayed. He said, for this thing I besought the Lord thrice that it might depart from me. He did all the right things. He prayed, and God said, no, it's going to stay with you. Well, does the grace of God somehow give me special powers of endurance so that I don't even feel the sickness? I don't think so. In fact, some of God's choicest servants have been sick and suffered. In 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 20, Paul said, Trophimus have I left at Miletus sick. There was no healing for him. He was a sick man, and Paul said, you can't go on, just stay here and try to recover. Well, does the grace of God mean that I don't need to deal with my infirmity? I don't believe in doctors. I don't believe in medicine. So I'll just tough it out. Well, I think it's proper to use medicine and get some medical help. Paul said to Timothy in 1 Timothy 5:23, drink no longer water, use a little wine for thy stomach's sake and thine often infirmities. Seems like young Timothy he had some health problems. And Paul said, I'll tell you, drinking the water there in Ephesus, it's not good for you. He said, drink a little wine. Now, by the way, that wine is not alcohol. That's the fruit of the vine. Pure, squeezed from the grapes. He said, that'll be better for your stomach. And we know with the parable of the Good Samaritan that the oil in the wine had healing properties. That's why when people are sick and they can call the elders of the church, the pastors of the church, to come and pray, and they will anoint them with oil. And it's not just pouring a little olive oil on someone's head, but it's really reflecting the idea of medical help, which was prevalent in those days a little differently than all the pills we have to pop. So how is the grace of God sufficient? If it doesn't take away my sickness, it doesn't give me special strength to endure and put up with it, or that I don't need anyone else to help me, well, I believe the grace of God operates in two ways, I should say, not different, with respect to infirmities that are suffered by a Christian who is sold out to the Lord. Number one, the grace of God gives us a divine perspective, and number two, it does give us a divine power. So I want to talk about those briefly. First of all, the perspective of grace. When a believer suffers an infirmity, if he'll listen, God will give, his grace will give an understanding of things. You see, going through a sickness, a lot of times all we do is we just see four walls closing in on us, so to speak. But when we can look at things through God's eyes, we can have release from any despair over our condition. That's what enabled the Apostle Paul to finish his course with joy. Even though he had this thorn in the flesh that was nagging him on a daily basis, there wasn't a moment he was free from it. But he was able to finish his course with joy. That's an amazing thing. And how did that happen? Well, three things about seeing things from God's point of view. Number one, there's an understanding of the frailty and the finiteness of life. I think it helps if we understand that we get sick because of sin, ultimately. Job 14 verses 1 and 2 says, "Man that is born of a woman is of few days and full of trouble. He cometh forth like a flower and is cut down. He fleeth also as a shadow and continueth not." In James chapter 4 and verse number 14, "Whereas ye know not what shall be on the morrow, for what is your life? It is even a vapour that appeareth for a little time and then vanisheth away." You know, everything in our life is time controlled, isn't it? And we think, well, 70 years, 80 years, 90 years of age, that's a long time. Not when you measure that against the vastness of eternity. It's just like a vapour, a wisp of steam that comes from the kettle or something like that, and you see it, but it floats off and it's gone. That's what our life is like. Psalm 90 verse 10 says the days of our years are 70 years and 10. That's 70 years. "And if by reason of strength they be 80 years, yet is their strength labour and sorrow, for it is soon cut off, and we fly away." Well, 70 years, 80 years. Queen Elizabeth, she's lived beyond 90 years. Must have good genes, I guess. Her mother lived over 100 years. Some people do. But in the average, 70 years is the lifespan. 80 years if you have some physical strength. And God gives us that. But there's an end to it. We're soon cut off and we fly away. And if we're saved, we go to heaven. That's the good thing. So we understand this, and when we do understand it, it enables us to understand, first of all, why do I get sick? Why do I get sick? And it helps us to understand why we cannot always do the things that we did when we were younger. Some of you older folks, you had ministries in the church that you were engaged in and involved in. Nowadays, you just can't do it. It helps you to understand why you just can't do it. By the way, that's why we emphasize that only one life will soon be passed. Only what's done for Christ will last. So God gives us an understanding of why we get sick. Secondly, he gives us an understanding that he has a purpose in that sickness that we're going through. That's what Paul found out in verse number 7. There was a reason for this, why God allowed it. He said, "And lest I should be exalted above measure through the abundance of the revelations, there was given to me a thorn in the flesh, the messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I should be exalted above measure." You know, it's interesting that Paul didn't pray for grace. No, he prayed that God would deliver him. And it is okay to pray about that. We should pray. We should bring our sorrows and our sicknesses before the Lord. There's nothing wrong with that. But sometimes we just need to understand that this infirmity is going to be with me until I end my life here on this earth. I find it interesting that Paul never brought this up again. He didn't bring it up every week. Oh, pray for me, I've got this infirmity. Once he realized, once God had revealed to him that this was something that was for life, he got on with life. Paul was a mighty servant of our Lord. There's no doubt about that. And all the things that he accomplished, all the souls that he had won, all the churches that he had established, and the scriptures that God had enabled him to write through direct revelation from heaven. And this great experience of being caught up to heaven, whether I was dead, I don't know, God knows that, but I saw heaven. Man, that guy could have tooted his horn, he could have stuck out his chest and marched around and boasted, and people would admire him. And God said, no, I'm going to give you something to remind you that you're just a man that's been used of God, and you're not going to boast. You see, afflictions are trials. Sickness is a trial. And we know as Christians that God always has a purpose in trials. And it's important that we accept this truth. Hezekiah didn't do that. The Bible says in 2 Chronicles 32, in those days Hezekiah was sick unto death, and he prayed unto the Lord, and he spake unto him and gave him a sign. By the way, that sign was to move the shadow on the sundial backwards 10 degrees. Scientists have figured out that that's about a day or something like that. Of course, be careful what you read on that, but what a sign. Just as God said to the sun, stand still in the days of Joshua, he moved things around. God's got this world in his hands, right? But Hezekiah rendered not again according to the benefit done unto him, for his heart was lifted up. He got proud. Therefore was wrath upon him and upon Judah and Jerusalem. Notwithstanding, Hezekiah humbled himself for the pride of his heart, both he and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, so that the wrath of the Lord came not upon them in the days of Hezekiah. You know, sometimes we can get a little proud in what we've done for the Lord. Don't be surprised if God allows something in your life just to keep you on praying ground, just to keep you dependent on him day by day, just to keep you reminded that it's not of you, it's all of God. God will do that in that trial. And then thirdly, God's grace reminds us that our infirmities are momentary. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, you might want to just turn back there a few pages. But in verse 1, Paul is talking about this and his life. He says in verse 1, for we know that if our earthly house of this tabernacle were dissolved, he's talking about his body, one day our body will dissolve and go back to the dust. He said, if that happens, we have a building of God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. And in this we groan, earnestly desiring to be clothed upon with our home, with our house which is from heaven. If so be that being clothed we shall not be found naked. For we that are in this tabernacle do groan, being burdened. Not for that we would be unclothed, but clothed upon, that mortality might be swallowed up of life. Now he that hath wrought us for the selfsame thing as God, who also hath given unto us the earnest of the Spirit, therefore we are always confident, knowing that whilst we are at home in the body, we're absent from the Lord, for we walk by faith, not by sight. We are confident, I say, and willing rather to be absent from the body and to be present with the Lord. Wherefore we labour, that whether present or absent, we may be accepted of him. What that's telling us is that one day when this earthly body, this house of clay in which we live, comes to an end, we have something better. And heaven will be that much sweeter when we have passed through the trials of this life. You know, when a man comes down with an infirmity, a serious illness, often the reaction is, why me? Well, that's a self-centered reaction. Why me? Worse would be the reaction, well, where is God? I think that's a devilish reaction, because that's what Satan said in the garden. Where's God? He doesn't know what he's doing. The devil will try to get us to think that way, but you know, the Bible says that God's all-sufficient grace is there to enable us to rest in his word. God's grace is sufficient to save, right? We're saved by grace through faith in Christ, and his grace is sufficient to strengthen us. And when we understand that sufficiency, it leads to contentment. Contentment with God's presence in our life and God's comfort upon our life. So there is the perspective of God. Then there is the power of grace. You know, Paul was actively engaged in the work of the Lord. He was a human dynamo. I don't think any of us could ever keep up with him, but it would be easy for him to become proud, full of himself. But you know, when a man is full of himself, there's not much room for God and the Spirit of God. Think on this. He said there in verse number 9, my strength, and this is what Jesus is saying, my strength is made perfect in weakness. Now hang on, my strength, the strength of the Lord, is made perfect? The strength of the Lord is omnipotent, omnipotent, it's all powerful. But you see, it's like a sliding scale. And the more there is of man, the less God's power can work. The less there is of us, the more God's power can work in our life. And in that sense, the strength of God is made perfect when we are weak. The less of us, the more of him. That's why John the Baptist said, he must increase, I must decrease. And so Paul said, most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Now, Paul didn't resort to a poor me syndrome. Oh, let me tell you about my sickness. Let me tell you about my infirmity. He just said, the power of God can work in my life because I'm yielded to that situation. And the work of the Lord, think about it, everything is accomplished through the power of God, right? Yes, the Lord uses human vessels, such as you and I, and we are basically, we're weak and frail, but God uses us, and he provides the power to get things done. He gives us, for example, the power of the gospel. I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation. Unless your sickness has taken away your voice, you can give out the gospel. And you say, well, I don't have the strength to do that, but if you can speak the gospel, the power is in the gospel, not in you. It's in God. He gives us the power of the Holy Ghost. Paul had that power working in and through his life. There's the power of prayer. Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 5, not that we are sufficient of ourselves to think anything as of ourselves, but our sufficiency is of God. And those who serve the Lord must serve him in his way and in his strength. Turn with me, if you will, to the Old Testament book of Isaiah the prophet. Isaiah chapter 40, verse 28 through 31. You know, God's word is consistent here, and in verse 28, he tells us about himself. He says, hast thou not known? Hast thou not heard that the everlasting God, the Lord, the creator of the ends of the earth, fainteth not, neither is weary? There is no searching of his understanding. He giveth power to the faint, and to them that have no might he increaseth strength. Even the youth shall faint and be weary, and the young men shall utterly fall. But they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. Beloved, sickness may be preventing you from having a physically active ministry, but it doesn't keep us from loving souls and praying for sinners and the servants of God, and there's always a ministry. It may not be the same ministry you had 20 years ago when you were full of life and vigor, but even in our waning days, we can still serve God because of his grace. One of the greatest preachers that we know of, certainly in the 19th century, was Charles Hadden Spurgeon, a Baptist preacher known as the Prince of Preachers, but often we don't understand that he was a man who suffered greatly. He had health problems that were very painful. He had a painful gout, and he suffered from kidney disease. He also wrote about mental depression. You say, preacher, I thought Christians weren't supposed to be depressed. Well, you can be depressed, and he was. He had many bouts of melancholy, and a lot of it came from the burdens that he carried as he saw the affliction that racked the life of his beloved wife, Susanna. It really hurt him. It brought him down. And not only the painful health conditions that he had and the depression and his wife suffering so much, but in the latter part of his ministry, there was a huge theological battle that he fought against what was called the downgrade controversy that was weakening the Baptists in England. And Spurgeon stood for truth. These Baptists were saying, we need to water down our doctrine so that we can have unity. And Spurgeon said, I want unity, but unity at the expense of truth is treason. And he lost many friends in the ministry because of that. In fact, it's said that that's what ultimately cost him his life. And Spurgeon died before he reached the age of 58 years. In his writings, and he wrote a lot, he gave words of encouragement to us. In fact, he gave 7 things that he reminds us of when we are going through hard times of suffering, particularly with affliction. He said, number 1, God is good. Never forget that. God is good. He's always good. Number 2, he said, God will not forsake you. Now, there's scriptures for all of this, but we're not going to look at those here, but God will not forsake you. Remember that. He said, God awaits your prayers of faith. The prayer of faith shall save the sick. Doesn't mean it'll take away our sickness, but the prayer of faith will deliver us from the affliction in the sense of how we have to deal with it. Number 4, God's word will not fail you. Number 5, God is supremely trustworthy. Fall into the hands of the living God. Number 6, God's power is necessary. And then number 7, God is a loving Heavenly Father. Beloved, as we look at this verse of Scripture in verse 9, where Jesus said to Paul, who had this messenger of Satan, this thorn in the flesh, this physical ailment that he could see was some way hindering and hampering his ministry for the Lord. And so he prayed, Lord, take it away so I can serve you better. But God had a higher plan. He said, I'm going to leave it there so that you'll trust me more and rely on me more, and you'll get everything that you need from my grace. The Bible says, my grace is sufficient for thee. My strength is made perfect in weakness. And this morning, if this message applies personally to you, that you are going through some infirmity, some sickness in your life, will you write your name against that promise? Will you take it as a promise of God for you and rest in that? If you're suffering from infirmity, turn to the Lord, trust him, and he will give you the grace to take you through it until he calls you home. And then you'll be in a place where there is no more sickness, no more pain, no more crying, no more death. This life is a short life. We all wish for good health and strength all of our days, and maybe God in his grace will allow us to live out our days and then just drop dead at the end. I know a lot of preachers say, I just want to die in the pulpit. that's a noble thought. I don't know what you'd feel like if I keeled over dead right now. Probably shake us all up, just like Ananias and Sapphira when they dropped dead in church. The great fear came upon the church. Well, I hope that doesn't happen, but we have these desires, but sometimes God's plan for our life is a little different. And once we understand that God has a plan and a purpose, we can live with that. And his grace will see us through day by day. So I trust that this message will help you. I pray that it would help someone today